Hello, my name's Rebecca Ibel. On the occasion of our current exhibition, Bruce Robinson, Forerunners, which has been extended to June 19th, 2020, we are hosting a conversation between Bruce Robinson and Michael Goodson, the Senior Curator of Exhibitions at the Wexner Center for the Arts. Bruce Robinson is a visual artist known for his blending painting and sculpture, animated assemblages, and reflecting on African American history and culture. He received his BFA at the Kansas City Art Institute and MFA from Indiana University. He is a professor emeritus at the Columbus College of Art and Design, where he taught painting and figure drawing. His work has been included in numerous exhibitions, including the recent show, Ohio Diaspora, at the Rife Gallery, and the 5th anniversary of the Columbus Dresden Sister City Artists Exchange Program. Michael Goodson has worn many hats in his career in the arts. He's an artist and teacher, having received his MFA in sculpture from Cranbrook Academy of Art, and taught classes at Wittenberg, Wright State, and the University of Dayton. Michael was a gallery director at the James Cohen Gallery in New York prior to being the director of exhibitions at CCAD's Beeler Gallery. For the past few years, Michael continues to curate shows of important contemporary arts at the Wex. It's a privilege for me to bring these two together for a conversation in our virtual experience here. So with that, I hand the mic over to Michael.
Hi, Bruce.
Hello, Michael.
How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. So interestingly, I was largely unfamiliar with your work, so I thought, until when I came to see the show at Rebecca's Gallery a couple weeks ago. Was it a couple weeks ago? We've all lost track of time, I know. But what I quickly learned was that I wasn't as unfamiliar as I thought. And you had, in fact, had, I think, perhaps 2 or 3 remote controlled, I want to say robotic pieces in the faculty exhibition at CCAD last year that Lucy Zimmerman, who was the associate curator at the Wexner Center, curated. So that was an interesting, and what's interesting about that to me was the comparative stasis of Rebecca's show to the kind of whimsy and literal mobility of those pieces at CCAD. In the interim, I've kind of come to join them together. They make more sense to me now that I've thought about it. But I guess I wanted to start out, before going in maybe to some autobiographical things, kind of get a sense of the juxtaposition of those 2 bodies of work. Maybe a description, and Rebecca may be able to pull up in post-production some images of those mobile works from CCAD, but maybe talk a little bit about how these 2 bodies of work speak to each other or go together.
Well, the mobile assemblages emerged out of static wall-hung assemblages. And one of the characteristics of my thinking process as an artist is the phrase, what if? What if? And I've been doing wall-hung assemblages using found materials for a number of years. And then one day I asked myself the question, well, what if I could somehow make these pieces move? And so then I embarked on a process of trial and error, some experimentation, figuring out how to incorporate the richness of assemblage process, but then have the assemblages move through space. They're not really robots, they're remote control vehicles. I think the technical terms ROV and so forth, but that's the origin of those pieces. And I tried one and got what you might call a proof of concept piece, and that was one of the pieces that was in the faculty show. And once I figured out how to kind of regulate the weight ratio, because if the pieces are too heavy, then of course the assemblies won't move in an effective way. So constantly trying to regulate that and make that as efficient a movement as possible. So that's the origin of those. It relates to the paintings, the more static work, just in a sense of trying to be sensitive to materials, sensitive to kind of an improvisational process. And in the assemblages, you're improvising with materials found, objects, and so forth. And in the static plywood pieces, shaped plywood pieces, the improvisation is more working with shapes and colors and manipulating surfaces within the shaped plywood. So that's the primary connection, I think.
I think what's interesting about it to me is that they both emanate from what we think of traditionally as painting. They both sort of move out from this idea. In terms of the robotic pieces, it was this impulse to kind of make a painting or an assemblage. I have a really broad perspective on what painting can be, maybe too broad in moments, but I really actually did perceive them as kind of mobile paintings. I think in part because I loved the way the small gallery in which I experienced them, they were juxtaposed with these very beautiful, I would argue, academic paintings by Julie Taggart. And somehow they made sense to me. There was this sort of dialogue between the magical stasis of those paintings and then the paintings come to life that I perceive them to be. In the same way, the paintings, I'll call them paintings, the plywood cutout works that are currently at Rebecca's gallery kind of move away out of painting in almost a different direction. Or maybe somewhere along the line of the same trajectory. They come out of painting, quite literally, it's this kind of linear cutout of what a whole painting might be, or at least that's one way I've come to think of them. Although the painting on those linear elements is really intricate and sensitive, you really have to be in the room with them. People viewing this will see pictures of these paintings, but I don't know how you get a sense of how they operate until you're actually in the room with them, which is really one of the kind of vexing components of this moment we're all experiencing. We have to kind of look at everything or most things on a screen right now, which for these objects is a little sad because the minute I walked into the gallery, the suite of paintings all spoke to each other. Depending on where I was in the room, the perspective changed dramatically. They were very alive, I thought. But I'm curious of what you think about this idea of both those bodies of work kind of coming out of what we traditionally think of painting. Is that your perspective on that?
To some extent, yeah. I think one of the additional linkages between the two types of work is a kind of tactility, and try to be as sensitive as possible to varied surfaces and so forth, and to form a more of a sensual connection with the viewer. And I think the shape plywood pieces are connected in a kind of art historical way. I don't want to get too heavy into that. But one of my favorite early modernist innovative painters is George Braque, the co-inventor of Cubism. And you know, Picasso always gets most of the accolades for Cubism, but I think Braque was extremely significant. And one quote that I remember writing in a journal years ago, where he talked about linear perspective, Euclidean perspective that traditional painting was based on, realism. He called it a disaster because his idea is that painting should not recede, but should push forward. And so a lot of his work involved aggressively trying to push out of the picture plane into the viewer's space. And though not trying to imitate rock, I think the shaped plywood paintings kind of activate the space a little bit around them and maybe in front of them a little bit, similar to what the point Rock was trying to make.
That's really interesting to me because I had that immediate sense as well. And I think it comes down to being able to see the space quite literally through the paintings. I mean, more tangibly, the way the show is lit creates this sort of shadow play that also animates the paintings. But more than that, formal issues like, because they're figurative works, all of them, formal issues like foreshortening in some of the runners, for instance, was really fascinating to me. Quite literally within the space, moving my body 8 feet within that space completely changed the way I was perceiving them. And it got me from the realm of perceiving them as figurative works and appreciating that formal element of foreshortening to, as I moved closer, really appreciating what you do with paint itself. We had this really brief conversation about why some of the uniforms on the runners specifically were patterned, striped specifically. And you had this really straightforward answer. It basically was about kind of an ocular or visual engagement with them, that making the most sense. I'm curious about if you could talk a little bit about that. And I do want to get into what the paintings mean historically for you, but I was just so taken by how they worked formally. I'd like to maybe take that apart a little bit.
Sure. The rationale for incorporating basically striped patterns in the paintings that deal with the runners was to create kind of an active optical effect, vibration, if you will. And that vibration echoes or reinforces the gestures of the figures. So if the figures were painted with just flatter colors, less animated, you might say, I don't think it would be as powerful a synergy between the pattern and the gestures of the moving figures. And I think trying to activate the surface is a formal goal that almost any painter has, whether it's more of a representational, traditional painter or more abstract or whatever format the person is working in. Because painting is such a static medium, it has to compete oftentimes unsuccessfully with more kinetic media that we all are bombarded with. So I think the task of the painter is to be able to activate the surfaces. My effort also is to engage in a layering process of the paint itself, the material itself. So they're not carefully blended or modulated colors. They're usually laid down in planes. There's a lot of scraping and kind of building up and breaking down of the surfaces to try to enrich and activate the shapes that operate within the graphicness of the shaped image. So layering is very important, and that's one of the reasons also that I chose plywood as a medium. I mean, I could have chosen masonite or some other hard material, but I chose plywood for its, at least to me, metaphorical dimension because it's comprised of 3 to 4, sometimes 5 layers, depending on how thick the plywood is. But the plywood itself is metaphor as well as a support for the paint manipulation itself.
And then, you know, there's one other painting I wanted to talk about specifically because of the way it's painted before we talk about maybe some of the historical components to these paintings, which And we can segue from this painting because there's such a deep, rich, in moments strange history involved with it too. But it's the racing horses, and really just the way the muscularity of those horses is painted, which is really nothing less than the appearance of lightning. And I was wondering if you could talk about that just a little bit.
Sure. First, as a kind of a precursor, that painting would not exist had I not been given a book, Christmas present from my son, called The Black Maestro. That's the name of the book. And it's about a black jockey around the turn of the 20th century. His name is Jimmy Wingfield, who was an extraordinary jockey during that time, won hundreds of races and so forth. And that book was so compelling to me that I felt the urge to make some kind of image. And so after doing some preliminary drawings and trying out different ideas and so forth, I came up with the image of the double horses, two horses racing sort of neck and neck. And for me, it has literal and also metaphorical and social and cultural dimensions, which makes it, I hope, a rich visual experience for the viewer. That particular painting is painted with oil paint, but also there's part of it is the horses are actually painted with spray paint, and the lightning that you see within the shape of the horses is a substitute for the muscular anatomy that people would most associate with a painting or drawing of a horse. There's so many specialist artists who can do that way better than I could, and I was trying to find an alternate method of conveying the energy and also the power of these massive animals that these two little guys perched on the back were able to control with such grace and expertise. And the other jockey, there's no real reference, but I was basing that on another sort of contemporary of Jimmy Wingfield. His name was Isaac Murphy. And he was also a little bit of a predecessor of Jimmy Wingfield. He was also extremely successful for that time. He lived actually a pretty lavish lifestyle, according to the book. And this was in the Jim Crow South. So that's a social dimension that both these athletes had to contend with. Jimmy Wingfield was a fascinating character. I would tell my son that could almost make a movie out of this guy's life. Because of Jim Crow, he was forced to relocate to Europe. And of all things, he ended up being part of the Russian Revolution. Now go figure, how does a little black kid from Louisville, Kentucky end up somehow immersed in the Russian Revolution? But that's what happened.
I think it's really interesting that there are so many histories folded into that one painting. I'm really curious about the specificity of the history of African American jockeys, but really what struck me about the show is there were kind of three primary histories that are tackled. One having to do with the dancers, the other having to do with the runners, which I know has like kind of at least a slightly personal history folded into it. And then the history of the jockeys. And I'm curious if you can just address, briefly those three histories, so people who see the show know the historical context of what they're seeing and what has like the empirical or historical underpinnings for your work.
Well, the runners in the show, there are three paintings with the images are derived from basically track events, and they emerged from a couple of summers ago watching European, I think they're called the Diamond League track meets. And I was just really struck by the beauty and the grace of these sprinters, and also the middle distance runners especially. And again, the main impetus is the question, what if? You know, what if I could somehow attach some kind of graphic power to two runners that are in contention with one another, exerting their kind of maximum effort as they approach the finish line. And occasionally you would see a person exerting himself or herself to such an extent that they would lose their balance and fly across the finish line. So that was the main impetus for the image source for those. Because the track meets, the televised track meets, are so quick and visual that it's hard to freeze that image. So I had to pull on my personal experience and figure drawing skills, such as they are, to see if I could essentially reconstruct these running figures and kind of catch them at that seminal moment, if you could use that term. The one single figure in the show, running figure, that's actually based on a real person. That's based on, I believe he's in Ohio, named Edwin Moses. And he was a great track man back in the 80s and early 90s, I think.
Well, you know what's interesting about those two? I didn't actually know till this moment, my miss, but that was based on Edwin Moses. I grew up a little bit in Dayton, Ohio, and I believe Edwin is from Dayton, Ohio.
I believe so, yeah.
And he was this. There's actually a kind of athletic center, I think at University of Dayton, that's named after him. He's an incredible figure. Here was a guy who was born to do that. I mean, just kind of unbelievable. But you know what I love about those is you really do capture that collapse of bodies that occurs at the end of a race, where they're milliseconds apart. They're kind of literally in time and space sort of collapsing upon one another. And you do get that dynamism in those paintings. The foreshortening of the legs is a huge part of that. And again, it's a component of these paintings that I don't think I could have accurately felt unless I had actually walked into the gallery with them. But I really love that about those paintings. The other history I'm curious about is the two paintings that are based on dance.
Oh, okay. Well, those paintings were the painting titled Nexus, showing two dancers kind of in a moment of stasis, are actually less dynamic than the runner paintings. And I think I did that on purpose to try to avoid the cliches of what you normally think of when you see a dance painting or drawing or sculpture of a dancer. More of a moment of rest. The image sources for that came from watching a documentary on the ballet dancer named Misty Copeland, who's a prima primary ballerina for, I think, the American Ballet Company, or one of the major New York ballet companies. And it focused, the documentary that is, it focused on her upbringing and how she basically overcame a lot of obstacles to become one of the great dancers in the ballet world. And again, the question, what if I could somehow combine two figures into a unified image and create a sense of rhythm through the linear drama of the lines, but still caught in a static moment. So a weird kind of interplay between static and kinetic on a formal level. And then the other formal challenge that I push on myself a lot is to see how much of the material I can cut away and still have a strong graphic image. So that image and the other one of the divers is essentially a line drawing in plywood in a formal sense, and trying to catch the interplay between stasis and movement, and still create a strong image. And that takes a lot of preliminary drawings and figuring things out and trying to get things to work together and in some kind of effective visual way.
It's interesting that you talk about the interplay between that which is stasis and the essence of movement, because I think in varying degrees they all capture movement. Your sitters aren't sitting. They're moving as fast as or as choreographed as possible, and that's very interesting to me. The whole show is actually kind of a study of movement, up to and including the bird painting, which again is like sort of capturing movement in a static moment. It's such a different kind of way of thinking about movement than, say, those remote control works, which is quite literal movement and funny movement. There's something really humorous about those works to me. But I do think it draws upon so many things. It draws upon, well, drawing. They're kind of beautifully linear and drawn. I think it draws upon photography, because really everything you're talking about is either you probably have sourced at least components of it through photography, or quite literally maybe hitting pause on on whatever you're watching it on to kind of capture that moment. That's really fascinating to me, and I just now thought about the fact that the spectrum of movement between those two bodies of work that I know, the remote control pieces and the depiction of movement in these other works, is such a broad perspective on the very idea of movement. It's fascinating to me. I would say probably in closing, Bruce, one of the things that occurs to me as well is, aside from all of these elements of process, materials, history, maybe it sounds to me like the catalytic thing in your engagement with these paintings is your own curiosity. With every description, you have gone back to this source material that is turned on in part by your curiosity about these histories, about these materials. That's really interesting for me. You can feel it in the work, I think.
Well, that's a great comment, because curiosity is probably one of the primary parts of my aesthetic persona, you might say. And the curiosity lends itself to investigation of ideas, not only the idea itself, but how you approach an idea and how you can take that idea and morph it into some kind of tangible form that can move around or sit on the wall in some kind of interior space, and provide a contemplative experience for any viewer that wants to take advantage of that. That's what I hope for.
Yeah, I feel that. I feel that in the show. I hope to get back into the space too. I think actually seeing the work post this conversation would be really interesting. I also like to see it alone, if that makes any sense. Like thinking about all these things that you've said, it would be interesting just to go in and just spend some time with the works alone, I think. maybe that's possible over the next few weeks. It sounds like Rebecca is extending the show a little bit. We'll have to confirm that, but that would be great. I really appreciate you talking with me about these paintings today.
Well, I appreciate our conversation, and I appreciate your thoughtful questions. And I'm sure we'll get together a future time and continue our conversation.
Well, let's make a plan to stand 10 feet apart and look at your show again. Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Next few weeks.
Okay. Thank you, Michael.
Sounds great.
Well, I look forward to welcoming you back. I'll make sure to give you your alone time in the gallery anytime you want. It does sort of fit the time that we're in now. We'll be inviting people back into the space a few at a time. And so that's why we extended the length of the exhibition. Because I thank you so much for pointing out they really do come alive, and there's such great energy seeing them in person. So thank you, Michael, so much. It's such an honor to have you join us in conversation. And thank you, Bruce. It's such a privilege to work with you, and I look forward to welcoming everyone in to see them in person.